I stood outside his door, my hand frozen mid-air. My mind screamed, "Don't do this!" But my heart, it begged me to knock. What if this moment ruins everything? What if the truth I uncover is something I can never take back? I didn't know it yet, but this was the point of no return. When I stood outside his door that night, my heart pounding in my chest, I never imagined the chain of events it would set into motion. What do you do when a moment of curiosity turns into a secret so heavy it threatens to shatter everything you've built? How do you face the truth when it's too dangerous to speak it aloud? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss a tale like this. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below as we uncover this emotional journey together. It had been a quiet evening, with my husband out of town again on one of his business trips. The house always felt emptier without him, but lately, that emptiness had been filled with something else. An unnerving tension that lingered every time my stepson and I were in the same room. Knock, knock. The sound was louder than I expected, breaking through the silence like a thunderclap. I held my breath, listening for movement inside. A second later, the door creaked open just a crack, and there he was, looking at me with those piercing eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "What's up?" he asked, his tone casual, but his posture was anything but. He stood stiffly, blocking my view into the room. I forced a smile. "Just checking in. You've been in here all evening. Everything okay?" "Yeah, just busy with stuff." His response was clipped, and his eyes darted away. "What kind of stuff?" I tried to peek past him, but he shifted slightly, his broad frame filling the doorway. "School. The usual." It wasn't unusual for him to be distant. He'd always kept to himself, but this felt different. I wanted to press him further, but the air between us was thick, and I could feel the unease radiating from both of us. "Well, let me know if you need anything," I said, stepping back. "Sure," he replied, closing the door slowly, his eyes lingering on mine for just a moment too long. As I walked back to the kitchen, memories of the past few months flooded my mind. When I married my husband, I knew blending families wouldn't be easy, but I had hoped to build a connection with my stepson. At first, things were cordial, even friendly. We shared dinners, movie nights, and the occasional heart-to-heart. But as he grew older, the walls went. It wasn't just typical teenage angst. This was something else. He'd become quieter, more withdrawn, and his interactions with me had taken on a strange intensity. I tried to chalk it up to his struggles with his father's absence. My husband's work had taken him out of the home more and more, leaving me to play both parent and peacekeeper. But lately, I'd felt something shift. The way he looked at me was no longer the indifferent glance of a stepson. It was deeper, more deliberate, and it left me questioning myself in ways I wasn't prepared for. That night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart raced. I told myself it was nothing, probably just him grabbing a midnight snack. But when the footsteps stopped outside my bedroom door, seconds passed like hours before I finally called out, "Is someone there?" The door didn't open, but I heard his voice, soft and uncertain. "It's just me. I thought you might be awake." I sat up, pulling the covers around me. "What's wrong?" He hesitated before stepping into the room, his tall frame silhouetted by the dim hallway light. He looked uncomfortable, running a hand through his hair. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Me neither," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence stretching out between us. Then he shifted, leaning against the door. "I feel like things are weird lately," he said, his voice low. "What do you mean?" "You and Dad, and you and me." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could I deny what we both felt but couldn't name? The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and unspoken tension. I busied myself with household chores, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something had irreversibly changed. One evening, as I was making dinner, he walked into the kitchen. He stood close, too close, watching me as I chopped vegetables. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. No, I've got it," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He didn't move, and I could feel his presence like a physical weight. Finally, I turned to him, a nervous laugh escaping my lips. "You're acting strangely," I said, trying to keep the mood light. "Am I?" He smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. I swallowed hard, turning back to the cutting board. "Yes, you are." He stepped closer, his arm brushing against mine as he reached for the salt. The touch sent a jolt through me, and I froze, the knife trembling in my hand. "I think you're the one acting strange," he said, his voice low and teasing. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His eyes bore into mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. "We shouldn't," I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "I know," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. But neither of us moved. The air between us grew heavier with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to step away. I turned back to the stove, gripping the counter to steady myself. Behind me, I could still feel his presence, an unspoken tension radiating from him like heat. I think you should go back to your room," I said softly, not daring to look at him. My voice sounded weak, uncertain, even to me. "Is that what you want?" His voice was low, challenging, and so close that I felt his breath on the back of my neck. "Yes," I said, but the word came out as more of a whisper than the firm denial I'd intended. He didn't move, and the silence stretched out endlessly. Then, finally, I heard the faint scrape of his chair as he stepped back. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in the quiet kitchen, and when I was sure he was gone, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The next few days were agonizing. I avoided him as much as I could, retreating to my bedroom whenever he was home and leaving the room whenever he entered. But no matter how much distance I tried to create, the memory of that night in the kitchen lingered, haunting me in every quiet moment. My husband called from his hotel on the third night. His voice was warm, cheerful even, as he asked about my day and told me about the conference. I tried to focus on his words, but all I could think about was the tension in the house and the way I'd nearly crossed a line I couldn't uncross. "I miss you," he said, breaking through my thoughts. "I miss you too," I replied, forcing a smile into my voice. "When are you coming home?" "End of the week," he said. "I've got a surprise for you." "What kind of surprise?" "You'll see," he teased. "Just hold tight a little longer, okay?" "Okay," I said, though my chest felt tight with guilt. "I love you." "Love you too," he said before hanging up. I set the phone down and stared at the blank screen. What was I doing? How had things gotten so out of control? I was supposed to be the adult, the one holding this family together. Instead, I was unraveling, letting something dangerous and forbidden creep into the cracks of my marriage. That evening, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I found myself wishing for the noise of the television or the hum of my husband's voice. Anything to drown out the silence. "Yes, you do." His voice was soft but insistent, and I felt his hand on my shoulder, light and tentative. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I stiffened, unsure whether to pull away or lean into it. "This isn't right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe not," he said, his hand slipping away. "But that doesn't change the fact that it's happening." I turned to face him, my chest tight with a mix of fear and something else, something I didn't want to name. "We can't do this." Why not? His eyes searched mine, and for a moment I saw vulnerability there, a crack in the confident facade he wore so well. Tell me why. Because it's wrong, I said, my voice breaking. Because it'll ruin everything. Everything's already ruined, he said bitterly. You and Dad barely even talk anymore. He's never here, and when he is, it's like you're just going through the motions. His words cut deep, hitting a truth I didn't want to admit. My marriage had become a hollow shell of what it once was, and I'd been clinging to the pieces, hoping they'd somehow fall back into place. But hearing it from him, laid bare and undeniable, was like a punch to the gut. That doesn't mean, I started, but he cut me off. It doesn't mean we should do this. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on mine. Maybe it doesn't, but it also doesn't mean we can just pretend it's not there. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. This has to stop. Does it? He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down my spine. Or are you just scared of what it means? I'm not scared, I said, though my trembling hands betrayed me. Yes, you are. His voice was soft now, almost a whisper. And so am I. But that doesn't make it any less real. For a moment, I let myself feel it, the pull, the connection that had been building between us for weeks. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and utterly terrifying. But as much as I wanted to give in, I knew I couldn't. I can't do this, I said, stepping back and breaking the spell. You're my stepson. This is wrong. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I get it, but just so you know, it's not just me. You feel it too. He turned and walked out, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a heart that felt like it might shatter. I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling as I buried my face in them. Whatever this was, it was spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. The days that followed were an exercise in denial. I threw myself into housework, errands, anything to avoid the lingering thoughts of him. But no matter how hard I tried, he was always there, in the corner of my mind, in the spaces of the house we shared, in the fleeting looks and near brushes that sent my heart racing despite myself. One evening, I decided to escape the suffocating tension by going out for a walk. The cool evening air was a welcome relief, clearing my head as I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood. By the time I returned, the house was quiet and dark, save for a faint glow coming from the living room. I stepped inside, setting my keys on the counter. His voice caught me off guard. You were gone a while. I turned to see him stretched out on the couch, his long legs crossed and a book in his hands. He looked at me over the edge of it, his expression unreadable. Just needed some air, I said, keeping my tone light as I moved toward the kitchen. Everything okay? He asked, his voice soft but probing. Of course, I replied, but even I didn't believe the words. I opened the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water to give myself something to do. Behind me, I could hear the quiet creak of the couch as he stood. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice closer now. I haven't, I said, spinning around too quickly and nearly dropping the bottle. He smirked, leaning casually against the doorway. Liar. I narrowed my eyes, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened at his playful tone. Don't you have something better to do? Not really. He took a step closer, his gaze locking onto mine. Why are you so nervous? I'm not nervous, I said, the words tumbling out too fast. His smirk widened and he took another step forward, closing the distance between us. You're a terrible liar. Go to bed, I said, my voice firmer this time as I moved to step around him. But he didn't move. Instead, his hand brushed mine as I passed, a feather-light touch that sent a jolt through me. You don't have to run away every time we're in the same room, you know, he said, his tone soft but teasing. I'm not running away, I said, though my feet were already carrying me toward the stairs. Sure you're not? I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me as I climbed the steps. When I reached my room, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering in my chest. This couldn't go on. I had to set boundaries, make it clear that whatever he was feeling, and whatever I was feeling, was unacceptable. But when I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, all I could think about was the way his hand had felt against mine. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. Groggily, I made my way downstairs to find him in the kitchen, a mug in his hand and an easy smile on his face. "Morning," he said, sliding a cup toward me. "Thanks," I mumbled, taking it and sitting at the table. "You're up early," he said, leaning against the counter. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted, avoiding his gaze. He nodded, sipping his coffee. "Me neither." For a while we sat in companionable silence, the tension from the night before seemingly gone. But then he broke it, his voice soft and tentative. "Do you ever think about what things would be like if they were different?" I looked up, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "If we weren't, you know." He trailed off, his eyes searching mine for some kind of answer. "That's not something we should talk about," I said, my voice firm but my resolve shaky. "Why not?" he pressed. "Because it's not appropriate," I said, standing to put distance between us. He followed, setting his mug down and stepping closer. "Maybe it's not, but that doesn't mean it's not real." "Stop," I said, turning to face him. My hands trembled at my sides. "You need to stop." He stared at me, his expression a mix of frustration and longing. "Tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth to deny it, to shut this down once and for all, but no words came. "Exactly," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Before I could react, he stepped forward, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, and for a moment I couldn't move. "This isn't right," I said, finally finding my voice. "I know," he said, his eyes locked on mine, "but it doesn't change how I feel." I shook my head, backing away. "We can't do this. It'll ruin everything." "I don't care about everything," he said, his voice low and steady. "I care about you." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, and as much as I wanted to run, to escape the pull between us, I couldn't deny the truth in them. "I need time to think," I said finally, my voice barely audible. He nodded, stepping back. "Take all the time you need." As I walked away, my heart ached with a mix of longing and dread. The line between us had blurred, and I wasn't sure I could ever make it clear again. One afternoon, I decided to treat myself to some self-care. I ran a hot bath, lighting a few candles and playing soft music to drown out the noise in my head. I sank into the water, letting the warmth envelop me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But then I heard it, a faint knock on the bathroom door. "Mom?" His voice was muffled but unmistakable. I tensed, pulling the bathrobe off the hook and wrapping it around myself before answering. "What is it?" "I just wanted to let you know I'm heading out for a bit," he said. "Did you need anything while I'm out?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter in my chest. "No, I'm fine, thanks for asking." "Okay," he said, and I heard his footsteps retreating. But something about the exchange left me unsettled. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that I was reading too much into everything. He was just being polite, I told myself. After my bath, I busied myself with dinner prep. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the sizzle of onions in the pan gave me a sense of normalcy, a reminder of the life I was trying so hard to keep on track. But as I stood there, stirring the pot, I felt a presence behind me. "You didn't hear me come in?" His voice was close, too close, and I turned to find him standing just a few feet away. "No, I didn't," I said, forcing a casual tone as I stepped back slightly. "How was your trip out?" Fine, he said, his eyes scanning my face. You seem tense. I'm not tense, I said quickly, turning back to the stove. Just busy. He didn't reply, but I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my hands trembled as I reached for the seasoning. You've been acting different, he said finally. I froze, my hand hovering over the pot. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, he said, stepping closer. You've been avoiding me. I turned to face him, clutching the wooden spoon like a lifeline. I think we both know why. He didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes searching mine. You don't have to be scared of me. I'm not scared of you, I said, though my trembling voice betrayed me. Then why are you running away? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. We're adults. We can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, I said, turning back to the stove. It was a mistake. That's all. Is that really what you think? He asked, his tone challenging. Yes, I said firmly, though the word felt like a lie. He sighed, stepping back. If that's what you want to tell yourself. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. I avoided his gaze during dinner, excusing myself as soon as the dishes were cleared. I sat in my room, staring at the blank television screen, trying to convince myself that I was doing the right thing. But the next day, it happened again. I was in the living room, folding laundry, when he walked in. He was on his phone, laughing at something, and for a moment he looked like the carefree young man I'd always known. But then he saw me, and his expression changed. Pusa rayon fokora. Hey, he said, putting his phone away. Do you need help with that? No, I'm fine, I said, keeping my eyes on the clothes in front of me. He sat down on the couch anyway, picking up a shirt and folding it neatly. You don't have to do everything by yourself, you know. I don't mind, I said, my voice tight. We worked in silence for a few minutes, the tension in the room palpable. Finally, he spoke. Do you ever think about that night? He asked, his voice low. I froze, the shirt slipping from my hands. What night? You'll know which one, he said, his eyes locked on mine. I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. We agreed not to talk about it. Did we? He asked, leaning forward slightly. Or did you just decide that? I stood, gathering the folded clothes in my arms. I don't think this is a good idea. He stood too, blocking my path. Why not? We can't just pretend it didn't happen. I am pretending, I said, my voice rising, and so should you. I can't, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I can't just forget it. I felt the weight of his words, the raw emotion in his voice, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. But then he stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, and the world seemed to stop. You don't have to fight this, he said softly. We can figure it out together. This isn't right, I said, my voice trembling. Maybe not, he said, his eyes searching mine. And it feels right, doesn't it? I couldn't answer. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but I couldn't find the words to stop him as he reached for me. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. My husband's voice echoed through the house, calling out a cheerful greeting. We sprang apart, panic flashing in his eyes as he backed away. I should go, he said quickly, grabbing his phone and disappearing down the hallway. I stood there, my heart pounding, as my husband walked into the room, his face lighting up when he saw me. Surprise, he said, holding up a bouquet of flowers. Thought I'd come home early. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I took the flowers from him. It's a wonderful surprise. You seem a little distracted, he said as we sat down for dinner. He'd picked up takeout from my favorite restaurant, another surprise to make up for his extended absence. Is everything okay? Of course, I said, forcing a smile. Just tired. It's been a long week. He nodded, accepting the excuse without question. I can imagine. Thank you for holding down the fort while I was gone. It's no trouble, I said, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, his absence had created a vacuum, one that had been filled by something dangerous and forbidden. And now that he was home, the weight of it pressed down on me harder than ever. I stole a glance at my stepson, sitting across the table with his usual quiet demeanor. He avoided my gaze, focusing intently on his food, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. Any big plans for the weekend? My husband asked, oblivious to the undercurrent of unease. Not really, I said, keeping my voice light. Just the usual. Well, I was thinking we could take a day trip somewhere, he said, his eyes lighting up. The three of us. It's been a while since we've done something as a family. I hesitated, the idea of spending an entire day together feeling like an insurmountable challenge, but I couldn't think of a good reason to refuse. That sounds nice, I said finally. Great, he said, smiling. We'll figure out the details tomorrow. After dinner, I retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of cleaning up. I needed a moment to myself, a chance to breathe and collect my thoughts. But it wasn't long before I heard footsteps behind me. You don't have to do all that, my husband said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. Come, sit with me. I'm almost done, I said, my voice tight. He pressed a kiss to my temple. You've been so tense lately. Is something going on? No, I said quickly, pulling away under the guise of reaching for a dish. I've just been stressed, that's all. He frowned, studying me for a moment. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I know, I said, forcing a smile. I'm fine, really. He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Okay, I'm going to head upstairs. Don't stay up too late. I won't, I promised. Once he was gone, the kitchen felt oppressively quiet. I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling as I tried to calm the storm of emotions threatening to consume me. But before I could pull myself together, I heard the door creak open again. This time it wasn't my husband. You two looked cozy, my stepson said, his voice low and edged with something I couldn't quite place. What are you doing in here? I asked, turning to face him. I couldn't sleep, he said, shrugging. Figured I'd see if you needed help. I don't, I said firmly. You should go to bed. He didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Does he know? Now what? I asked, my voice trembling. About us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There is no us, I said, my tone sharp. You need to stop this. Do I? He asked, his expression challenging. Because you're not exactly pushing me away. Go to bed, I said, my voice rising slightly. He stepped back, holding his hands up in mock surrender. Fine, but you can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I didn't respond. I turned back to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter as I heard him leave. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, the weight of his words hanging over me like a dark cloud. When I finally went upstairs, my husband was already asleep. I slipped into bed beside him, my body tense as I stared at the ceiling. The guilt was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the fear that I was losing control, that the life I'd built was slipping through my fingers. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of laughter. My husband and stepson were in the kitchen, their voices light and easy as if nothing had changed. I lingered at the top of the stairs, listening to their conversation and wishing I could erase the last few weeks. But when I walked into the kitchen and caught my stepson's eye, I knew that wasn't possible. The look he gave me was brief but charged, a silent reminder of everything we'd left unsaid. Morning, my husband said cheerfully, handing me a cup of coffee. Sleep well? Fine, I lied, taking a sip and forcing a smile. Great, he said. Let's get ready for our day trip. I thought we could head to the lake. That sounds nice, I said, though the idea of spending the day in close quarters with both of them filled me with dread. As we packed up the car and headed out, I kept my focus on the scenery, the miles of open road blurring into a haze. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, I couldn't escape the tension building between me and my stepson. And for a while, it was almost easy to pretend everything was normal. We laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the fresh air. The tension between my stepson and me buried beneath the surface. But every now and then I'd catch his eyes lingering on me, a quiet intensity that made my stomach twist. After lunch, my husband suggested a walk along the lake trail. The winding path was shaded by trees, and the cool breeze was a welcome relief from the summer heat. My husband walked ahead, camera in hand, stopping every few steps to capture the scenery. I stayed back, my steps slow and deliberate, while my stepson walked a few paces behind me. The quiet between us was heavy, the space charged with unspoken words. I could feel his eyes on me, and I fought the urge to turn around, to confront him, to say something, anything that would break the tension. "Beautiful, isn't it?" my husband called out, turning to wave at us. "Come take a look at this." I nodded, quickening my pace to catch up with him. He pointed at a cluster of wildflowers near the water, his excitement childlike and endearing. I forced a smile, crouching down to admire them, but I could feel my stepson's presence behind me, a shadow I couldn't ignore. As we continued walking, my husband pulled ahead again, disappearing around a bend in the trail. I paused, leaning against a tree to catch my breath, and my stepson stopped beside me. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "I'm just enjoying the scenery," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "That's not what I meant," he said, stepping closer. "You've been avoiding me all day." I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Can you blame me?" He tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know. You tell me." "This isn't the time or place," I said, glancing down the trail to make sure my husband was out of sight. "When is the time or place?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Because it feels like you're just running away." I opened my mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps cut me off. My husband reappeared, waving us over with a grin. "You've got to see this," he said, oblivious to the tension that had just been brewing. We followed him down the trail to a rocky outcrop overlooking the lake. The view was breathtaking, the water sparkling like diamonds under the sun. My husband wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close as he snapped a selfie. "You two should take one too," he said, handing the camera to my stepson. "Oh, that's okay," I said quickly, stepping away. "Come on, it'll be nice," my husband insisted. "Just one picture." I shook my head, my hands trembling in my lap. "Because it's not." Before he could respond, my husband stirred, mumbling something incoherent as he shifted on the couch. We both froze, the moment shattered as he opened his eyes. "Did I fall asleep?" he asked, his voice groggy. "Just for a bit," I said quickly, forcing a smile. He stretched, yawning as he sat up. "Well, I guess that's my cue to head to bed." I nodded, relieved as he stood and made his way upstairs. But as soon as he was gone, the tension in the room returned. My stepson stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. Instead, he turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. As I sat there in the dark, the weight of the day pressed down on me, the lines between right and wrong blurring further with every passing moment. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. My husband slept soundly beside me, his soft snores a reminder of the life I'd built, the promises I'd made. Guilt gnawed at me, but it was tangled with something else, something I couldn't fully understand. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the pull of the abyss both terrifying and irresistible. Dark, save for the faint glow of the kitchen light, I made my way to the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water and leaning against the counter as I tried to collect my thoughts. I didn't hear him at first. The sound of his footsteps was soft, almost hesitant. But when I turned, there he was, standing in the door. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the small space like a storm cloud. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. "I couldn't either," he said finally, his tone calm but edged with something unspoken. "You should go back to bed," I said, my voice trembling. "Your dad might wake up." He leaned against the counter opposite me, crossing his arms over his chest. "He won't. He sleeps like a rock." "Still," I said, clutching the bottle of water like a lifeline. "It's late." "I know," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "But it feels like we're always dancing around this, don't you think?" "There's nothing to dance around," I said quickly, though the words felt hollow. "We've already talked about this." "Have we?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent, "because it feels like you're just avoiding it." "I'm not," I said, though my trembling hands betrayed me. "I'm trying to do what's right." "And what's that?" he asked, stepping closer. "Pretending nothing's happening? Ignoring this?" "There is no this," I said, my voice rising slightly. "It's in your head." "Is it?" he asked, his tone calm but challenging. "Because if it's just in my head, then why are you shaking?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. He was close now, too close, his presence overwhelming. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped back, but the counter behind me left nowhere to go. "This isn't right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "But it's real." Before I could respond, the sound of a door creaking upstairs broke the moment. We both froze, the spell shattered as we listened to the faint sound of footsteps. My husband was awake. "Go," I whispered, my voice urgent. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching mine, before nodding and slipping out of the room. I stood there, my heart racing as the footsteps grew louder, and seconds later, my husband appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice groggy. "I couldn't sleep," I said quickly, holding up the water bottle as if it explained everything. "Just needed a drink." He nodded, yawning as he stepped into the kitchen. "You okay? You've been acting a little off lately." "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He frowned slightly, studying me for a moment before reaching for a glass. "You sure? You'd tell me if something was bothering you, right?" "Of course," I said, the words sticking in my throat. He nodded again, his concern fading as he sipped his water. "Come back to bed. You need some rest." "I will," I said, watching as he disappeared back upstairs. The kitchen was silent again, but the tension lingered like a shadow. My hands trembled as I set the water bottle on the counter, my mind racing. That had been too close. If my husband had come down just a minute earlier, I couldn't even finish the thought. I made my way back to bed, but sleep was impossible. The near miss had shaken me to my core, and I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't figure out how to untangle myself from the web I'd woven. The next morning, the house was filled with the usual morning chaos. My husband was rushing out the door for a meeting, kissing me quickly on the cheek before grabbing his keys. My stepson lingered in the kitchen, his eyes meeting mine briefly as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "Not now," I said, glancing toward the door to make sure my husband hadn't forgotten anything. He pressed. "You keep saying we'll figure this out, but you're just running away." I'm not running away," I said, though even I didn't believe it. "Then stop avoiding me," he said, his voice low but insistent. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I swallowed hard, glancing around the restaurant to make sure no one was paying attention. This isn't the place to have this conversation. Where is the place? He asked, his voice low. Because I'm starting to think you're never going to let us have it. There's nothing to talk about, I said, though the words felt hollow. We've already said everything that needs to be said. Have we? He asked, his gaze unwavering. Because it feels like we're just pretending. I opened my mouth to respond, but my husband returned to the table before I could speak. I felt a rush of relief as he sat down, his presence a shield against the dangerous conversation that had been brewing. But the reprieve was short-lived. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of strained smiles and forced laughter, and by the time we returned home, I was exhausted. As soon as we walked through the door, I excused myself and retreated to the bedroom, desperate for a moment alone. I sank onto the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands as my thoughts spiraled out of control. I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up, how much longer I could juggle the lies and the guilt without everything coming crashing down. I heard the faint creak of the floorboards outside the bedroom, and my heart leapt into my throat. A moment later, the door opened, and there he was, his expression calm, but his eyes blazing with intensity. We need to talk, he said, his voice steady. This isn't a good time, I said quickly, standing and moving toward the door. Your dad. He's asleep, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. We're not going to keep avoiding this. There's nothing to avoid, I said, my voice rising slightly. You're making this into something it's not. Am I? He asked, his tone calm but challenging. Because it doesn't feel that way to me. You're my stepson, I said, my voice trembling. This is wrong. Maybe it is, he said, stepping closer. But that doesn't change how I feel, and I don't think it changes how you feel either. I backed away, my heart pounding. You don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I do, he said, his voice soft but insistent. You can keep denying it if that makes you feel better, but we both know the truth. The truth is that this needs to stop, I said, my voice breaking. Whatever you think this is, it can't happen. It won't happen. Why not? He asked, his eyes searching mine. Because you're scared? Because you're afraid of what it means? I'm not scared, I said, though my trembling hands betrayed me. Then what's stopping you? He asked, stepping closer until he was just inches away. Tell me why you keep pulling away, why you keep running. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. My mind raced, a storm of guilt and desire and fear crashing together, leaving me unable to think, unable to breathe. Say it, he said, his voice a whisper. Say you don't feel anything, and I'll leave you alone. I stared at him, my chest tight with emotion. The words were on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't force them out. Instead, I turned away, tears welling in my eyes. That's what I thought, he said softly. The silence between us was deafening, and I could feel his presence behind me, the heat of his gaze like a physical touch. I knew I should tell him to leave, to put an end to this once and for all, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped between what I knew was right and what I couldn't deny. The sound of a door opening down the hall shattered the moment, and we both froze. My husband's voice called out, groggy and confused. Everything okay in there? He asked. My stepson stepped back, his expression unreadable. Yeah, he called out, his voice calm. I was just saying good night. Okay, my husband said, his footsteps retreating. I exhaled shakily, my hands trembling as I turned to face him. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine, before nodding slightly. We're not done, he said quietly, before slipping out of the room. I sank onto the bed, my heart racing as the enormity of what had just happened washed over me. The line between us had been blurred beyond recognition, and I didn't know if I could ever make it clear again. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted. The next morning, the house was unnaturally quiet. I avoided my stepson entirely, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom while my husband worked in his home office. The tension in the air was suffocating, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay hidden any longer. I went downstairs, hoping to busy myself in the kitchen and push the gnawing anxiety to the back of my mind. But as I opened the fridge, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart sank. "Can we talk?" His voice was low, calm, but laced with determination. I closed the fridge slowly, bracing myself as I turned to face him. "Not now," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Your dad." "Dad's on a conference call," he interrupted. "We won't be interrupted." I looked at him, my chest tightening. His posture was tense, his jaw set, and his eyes burned with the weight of everything left unsaid. There was no avoiding it now. "Fine," I said, crossing my arms. "What do you want to say?" "I want to know why you keep pretending," he said, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "Why you keep running from this." "Because there's nothing to run from," I said, though the words felt like a lie. "You're making something out of nothing." His eyes narrowed, his frustration boiling over. "Stop lying. To me and to yourself. I see it every time you look at me." I took a step back, the counter pressing against my lower back. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" he challenged, stepping closer. "'Cause it sure didn't feel like that last night. Or any of the other times." "Last night was a mistake," I said, my voice breaking. "All of it. Every moment. It's wrong." "If it's so wrong, then why can't you walk away?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Why can't you just tell me to stop and mean it?" "I have told you," I said, my eyes welling with tears. "I've told you over and over." "But you don't mean it," he said, his tone softening. "You can say it all you want, but your actions say something else." I shook my head, trying to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to me," he said, his voice raw. "Because I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that this isn't real." "It's not real," I said, my voice trembling. "It's confusion, it's loneliness, but it's not real." He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "It feels real to me." The sound of footsteps in the hallway made both of us freeze. My husband's voice called out, casual and unsuspecting. "Everything okay in there?" "Yeah," I called back, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Just talking." "All right," he said, his voice growing fainter as he moved away. We stood in silence for a moment, the tension between us thick and suffocating. Finally I spoke, my voice low and strained. "This has to stop," I said, my hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore." His expression softened, and for a moment I thought he might agree. But then he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "If you really mean that, then say it. Tell me to stop, and I will." "I'm serious," I said, my voice faltering. "This is over." "Say it like you mean it," he pressed. "Look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel anything." I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and damning. "That's what I thought," he said softly, stepping back. "You can lie to yourself all you want, but I know the truth." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me trembling and hollow. I sank into a chair, burying my face in my hands as the enormity of the situation crashed down around me. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds. But I didn't know how to fix it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My husband seemed oblivious to the turmoil beneath the surface, his cheerful chatter filling the empty spaces I couldn't bring myself to respond to. I went through the motions, nodding and smiling when necessary, but inside, I was unraveling. Later that evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, my husband came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. I stiffened at the contact, guilt clawing at my chest. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice warm and gentle. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He kissed my temple, his touch soft and affectionate. "Let me know if there's anything I can do." "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, I stared down at the soapy water, my hands trembling. The weight of the lies, the guilt, and the unresolved tension was crushing. Something had to give, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. The weight of the past weeks bore down on me with crushing intensity. The tension between my stepson and me had reached its breaking point, leaving me trapped in a web of guilt, fear, and emotions I couldn't fully understand. My husband's presence in the house was both a comfort and a constant reminder of everything I stood to lose. I knew something had to change. I couldn't live like this anymore. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind churned with possibilities. I thought about confronting my stepson again, about telling my husband everything, about packing a bag and leaving it all behind. But none of it felt right. No matter what I did, someone would get hurt, and the thought of that was unbearable. The next morning, I resolved to confront my stepson one last time. I had to put an end to this, to draw a line in the sand and reclaim the life I'd built. I waited until my husband left for work, the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway, leaving the house in a tense expectancy. I found my stepson in the living room, slouched on the couch with his phone in hand. He looked up as I entered, his expression wary, but unreadable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He sat up, setting his phone aside. "Okay." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. This can't go on. Whatever this is, whatever you think it is, it has to stop." He didn't respond immediately, his eyes searching mine. "You really think it's that simple?" "It has to be," I said firmly. "I love your father. I made a commitment to him, and I won't let this, whatever this is, ruin that." "I never wanted to ruin anything," he said, his voice low. "But I can't help how I feel." "I know," I said softly, my chest tightening. "But we have to move past this. For your dad, for this family." He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "You're right." The words were a relief, but they didn't erase the ache in my chest. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavy in the air. "I think it's best if we spend some time apart," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Maybe you could stay with your mom for a while, just until things settle down." He looked away, his shoulders tense. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I called my husband and told him we needed to talk when he got home. My stepson stayed in his room, the quiet in the house oppressive and suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that my world was about to change forever. When my husband walked through the door that evening, his face lit up with a warm smile. "Hey, everything all right? You sounded serious on the phone." I nodded, my heart pounding as I gestured for him to sit. "We need to talk." He frowned, concern flashing in his eyes as he sat on the couch. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "I've been struggling with some things I haven't been honest about." He leaned forward, his expression softening. "You can tell me anything, you know that." Tears welled in my eyes as I looked at him, the man I had vowed to love and cherish. "I haven't been myself lately. I've been feeling disconnected from you, from everything, and I think it's been affecting how I act." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We've both been busy, but we can fix this. Whatever it is, we'll work through it together." "I know," I said, my voice breaking, "but I need you to understand that I've been struggling with boundaries, with feelings I didn't expect." His brow furrowed, confusion and concern mingling in his expression. "What do you mean?" "I mean," my voice faltered, the truth clawing at my throat. But I couldn't say it, not like this, not without destroying everything. "I mean, I've let myself get overwhelmed, and I haven't been prioritizing our marriage the way I should." He nodded slowly, his grip on my hand tightening. "We'll figure it out. I'm here, no matter what." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you. That means more than you know." We sat in silence for a moment, his hand in mine, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was enough. Maybe I could bury the truth and move forward, rebuilding the life we'd built together. Later that night, I heard the faint creak of the stairs. My stepson appeared in the doorway, his face drawn and tired. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said quietly. "Going to stay with Mom for a while." I nodded, my chest tightening. "I think that's for the best." He lingered in the doorway, his eyes searching mine. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I never meant to make things harder for you." "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "And I'm sorry too. For everything." He nodded, his expression unreadable, before turning and disappearing down the hallway. I sank onto the bed, the weight of everything crashing down around me. The resolution wasn't perfect, and the scars left behind would take time to heal. But it was a start. The next morning, the house was quiet as my stepson packed his things. My husband offered to drive him to his mom's, and I stayed behind, standing at the window as the car pulled out of the driveway. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, the tension finally lifting but leaving an emptiness in its place. In the weeks that followed, my husband and I began to rebuild. We went on dates, spent more time together, and worked to bridge the distance that had grown between us. It wasn't easy and the guilt still lingered, but I was determined to move forward. As for my stepson, his absence was a constant reminder of the line I'd nearly crossed, the mistake I couldn't afford to repeat. We kept in touch sporadically, the conversations polite but distant. It was better that way. Life wasn't perfect, and the shadows of what had happened would always be there. But as time went on, I began to find peace in the small moments, in my husband's laughter, in the warmth of his touch, in the quiet certainty of a life rebuilt. The house was quieter now, almost unsettlingly so. Without my stepson's presence, the once familiar rhythm of our household had shifted. At first, I thought the silence would bring relief, a chance to clear my head and reclaim the normalcy I'd been so desperate for. But as the days turned into weeks, I found myself lost in the stillness, consumed by reflection. I spent long afternoons sitting on the back porch, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands as I stared out at the yard. Memories of the past few months replayed in my mind like scenes from a film. Moments I wished I could rewrite, decisions I wished I could undo. But no matter how much I replayed them, the reality remained the same. I had come dangerously close to unraveling. One afternoon, I received a text from my stepson. It was brief and to the point, just a few words, checking in to see how I was doing. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I tried to find the right words. "I'm okay," I finally wrote. "I hope you are too." His response came quickly. "I'm fine. Just wanted to make sure you're all right." It was a small exchange, but it left me shaken. I hadn't heard from him since he'd left. and hearing from him now stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried. I put the phone down, taking a deep breath as I tried to steady myself. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The tension, the near misses, the lines that had been blurred. It all felt like a distant memory, and yet so vivid it could have happened yesterday. I wondered how I had let it get so far, how I had allowed myself to become someone I didn't recognize. But amid the guilt and regret, there was also a sense of clarity. The situation had forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. The cracks in my marriage, the loneliness I'd ignored, the ways I'd lost sight of myself. And while the experience had been painful, it had also been a wake-up call. I knew I couldn't change the past, but I could control what came next. I could focus on rebuilding my marriage, on being honest with myself and my husband, on finding healthier ways to address the gaps in my life. It wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. As the days turned into months, I began to feel a sense of peace returning. My husband and I grew closer, our shared efforts to rebuild creating a stronger foundation than we'd had before. I threw myself into new hobbies, finding joy in small things like gardening and painting. And while the memory of what had happened would always linger, it no longer defined me. One evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, my husband walked in and wrapped his arms around me from behind. I smiled, leaning into his embrace. "You seem happy," he said, his voice warm. "I think I am," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty of the words. "Good," he said, kissing my temple. "You deserve to be." The weight of the past few months had finally started to lift. The shadows of my mistakes, though still present, no longer loomed over every moment of my day. Life had settled into a rhythm again, steady, predictable, and, most importantly, peaceful. My husband and I were closer than we'd been in years, and though I still carried the guilt of my actions, I had committed myself to moving forward. The finale of this chapter in my life came in a way I hadn't anticipated. It started with a phone call. It was a quiet afternoon when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I glanced at the screen and froze. My stepson's name flashed across it, a name I hadn't seen since our brief text exchange weeks ago. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before picking it up. "Hello?" My voice was steady, but my pulse raced. He said, his voice softer than I remembered. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." "Of course," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. "Is everything all right?" "Yeah," he said. I wanted to talk." I swallowed hard, leaning against the counter for support. About everything," he said. "About what happened, about how I left." We said our goodbyes and I hung up, staring at the phone in my hand. The conversation had been unexpected, but it felt like closure, a chance to finally put the past behind me. I wiped my eyes, a sense of relief washing over me. That evening, as I set the table for dinner, my husband walked in, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Something smells good," he said, kissing my cheek. "Just a little experiment," I said, gesturing to the pot simmering on the stove. "Well, it smells amazing," he said, wrapping his arms around me. "I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but I like it." "What do you mean?" I asked, turning to face him. "You just seem lighter," he said, "happier." I smiled, leaning into him. "Maybe I am." We ate dinner together, laughing and talking like we used to in the early days of our relationship. For the first time in months, I felt truly present, not weighed down by guilt or fear. I could see the man I fell in love with, and I was grateful for the chance to rebuild what we'd nearly lost. After dinner, we sat on the couch, the sound of the television filling the room as we cuddled beneath a blanket. I felt his hand squeeze mine, a small but comforting gesture that reminded me of how far we'd come. Thank you, I said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. For what? He asked, his brow furrowing. For not giving up on me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. For being patient, even when I didn't deserve it. He kissed my forehead, his touch gentle. You deserve everything, always, and I'll never give up on us. The words settled in my heart, a reminder of the strength of the bond we shared. It wasn't perfect, but it was real and it was worth fighting for. As the weeks turned into months, the shadows of what had happened began to fade. My stepson stayed in touch sporadically, his updates brief but reassuring. He was doing well, finding his footing, and I was proud of him in a way I hadn't expected. I knew we would always carry the memory of what had happened, but it no longer defined us. It was a part of our story, but it wasn't the whole story. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the weight of the day had lifted, I would think about how close I'd come to losing everything. It was a painful reminder, but also a powerful one. I'd been given a second chance, and I was determined not to waste it. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was mine, and I was learning to embrace it, flaws and all. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally on the right path, and that was enough.